Dan, over to you.
Welcome to everybody to this session today. We'll just wait for a minute or so to let everybody join and then we'll kick off. For those of you just joining, I just want to extend a really warm welcome to everybody. We're just going to allow people a minute or so just to join the webinar before we get going. Okay, we're gonna get going now. So again, to those that have just joined, a really warm welcome to today's event, the Race to Net Zero: Actionable Steps Towards Cleaner Air. I'm Dan, I'm from the Catapult, and I'll be guiding you all through today's event. So as we all know, in November this year, the UK is hosting the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. And the focus of this conference is very much going to be on climate action. What tangible steps do we need to take to meet the reduction targets agreed in Paris in 2015? And with a view to thinking about this, the Catapult has launched its Year of Climate initiative, which intends to answer the question, what happens after COP26? So through a number of events and facilitated sessions, we're hoping to explore the challenges that stand in our way from meeting those climate goals, the changes that we need to make, both as communities and individuals, and particularly how space can play a role in helping us with that. We hope that through this sort of series of events and activities within the Year of Climate, we can take the lessons learned to inspire new projects, new ways of working, and new innovations for tackling climate change. In this first event, we'll be thinking about innovations for cleaner air. Of course, poor air quality is not only the biggest environmental health issue facing the UK today, but it's an important factor in climate change mitigation action. So a meaty topic, and I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful group of experts to help guide us through that conversation. In terms of a few housekeeping bits, this meeting is being recorded, so it will be available once the session has ended for people to reflect back on. We're lucky that we're joined today by an illustrator who will be capturing the essence of the discussion from today's session, and again, we hope to share that perhaps later on in the session and certainly afterwards. Running time for the session will be just over an hour, so trying to keep it a short and sharp conversation. Format-wise, we're split into sort of two halves. We've got a first session, which is an introduction to sort of perspectives on air quality, net zero, and the climate crisis. Really focusing in on the role that of accountability that sits across both public and private sectors in driving change. And we'll be joined by John Carstensen and Cameron Scott from Mott MacDonald and Public, respectively. And finally, we should start as we intend to move on. And this topic of conversation is really about embedding accountability down at the individual level for driving change. So the challenge that I put out to all of you today is that we want this to be an interactive session. We don't want it to be broadcast only. So we really welcome questions from the audience to help steer and drive that conversation and make sure that it's focused in the right place. Now, as the speakers each step up to the mark, I'll allow them to introduce themselves. And at this point, I'll hand over to our first speaker, John. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join this exciting event. I'm John Carstensen. I'm Mott MacDonald's climate change lead for our international development activities and for our operations in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. Now, we're faced with a climate crisis of huge dimensions. We see it in our daily news feeds about wildfires in Russia and North America. We see it in floods in Europe, India, China, and drought in Madagascar. I can even feel it today in my study where I'm sitting right now. Now, Earth observations help us understand the scale of these impacts, and it is really important to utilize that information. When it comes to the question of the role of public and private sector in driving the change to address the climate crisis, I think both have key roles to perform. Governments need to set operational frameworks and give a sense of direction, laws, rules, and regulations. Lofty plans and targets are unfortunately not sufficient, and that seems in the lead up to COP26, where we are at the moment. Lots of ambitious commitments, and that's good, much less on what are the operational steps. Another part of the public sector that I think it's important to pay attention to is the part that is responsible for delivery of public services. And they need to change their business approaches to incorporate climate change, both in terms of emissions reductions and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. And as a business that works with providers of those services in transport, water, supply chains, energy, it's really encouraging to see that those shifts are happening in that space. The private sector itself needs to embrace the challenge of the climate crisis and reflect it in our business models and the business offers. And I actually take great pride in working for a business that I believe is on the forefront of this. Mott MacDonald are now carbon neutral and on the journey to being net zero by 2040. We have a carbon portal that complies with PAS 2080. It reveals the capital and operational carbon emissions of infrastructure assets. This allows our designers to quickly identify hotspots during the optioneering phase, facilitating low carbon design when decision making is more flexible. PAS 2080 is the world's first carbon management standard for infrastructure. And for a second year in a row, we have obtained this global standard for managing the infrastructure carbon across our group from the Lloyd's Register of Quality Assurance. And we are one of only a few businesses in the sector to date to have achieved this for projects globally. This acknowledges our ability to understand, manage, and reduce the carbon impact of our designs on global infrastructure projects. And carbon management is increasingly recognized by our clients as a key enabler to achieve the climate change commitments and to transition towards net zero carbon goals. And we need similar efforts for impacts of climate change and climate change risk management. We already have such risk assessments embedded across our business processes, and they're using GIS and other geospatial data. But we need to think beyond the individual assets. We also need to look at the social outcomes, and we are working on detailed frameworks for such assessments so we can help our clients understand what they can achieve. And I have to say, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England in the UK, was exactly right when he said that firms ignoring the climate crisis will go bankrupt. So where are we heading in terms of technology adoption for achieving net zero? A key component in this is using big data and looking at everything through a system of systems lens, basically taking us to pursuing overall climate smart development. Space technology is important in this space. Digital applications are important, but the starting point is that it's the use and handling of big data that is the most important thing. We need to embrace the power that analyzing and using big data will bring. And remote sensing is an important part of this across the whole spectrum of planning, design, operation, and monitoring and evaluation. We need to acknowledge that we have the technology we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to where they need to be. We don't have to wait for technology to take further action. At the same time, we must pursue innovation and technology development to take us there in an even faster and smarter way. Too often, however, we get blinded by the latest tech innovation and fail to recognize that that is merely a small, not always insignificant, but still small part of the whole picture. In my view, this means that we must embrace system of systems thinking to understand the synergies between sectors as well as trade-offs and unwanted consequences. System of systems approaches are essential, but such an approach will only work if we embrace big data and digital solutions. That'll be at the heart of the technology adoption to get to net zero and climate resilient societies. I also believe that a system of systems thinking will help us on our innovation pathway. So how do we influence change in the behaviors of communities and individuals to drive collective action for a more climate-friendly future? First and foremost, we need to focus on what climate action means to people. Too often, we only spell out what climate action means for emissions and technology solutions, and we present that very well in bars and graphs. However, there is always danger that this misses the point of what does it mean to people. And I think that will be one of the challenging issues for the space community to make sure that it becomes relevant. It's not just the satellite or the Earth observation technology that is important. It's what it can be used for and the outcomes it can achieve. And it is difficult for many of us because if you, like I am, you're very fascinated by the technology, then that ends up getting becoming our focus. But we need people to change, and that means we must make the change relevant to people. Secondly, we must look at individual and community behavior alongside the systems change that are needed for a climate-friendly future. We need to change our consumption patterns, our behavior at an individual and community level. But that's not enough. That change must be complemented by deep transformational systems change across food, energy, transport sectors, all the sectors really. Behavior change alone will not be sufficient. Like I saw today that global electricity demand is growing faster than renewables can keep up, despite renewables growing at a record pace. So let's acknowledge that there is a lot of progress towards shifting our economy to a no or low carbon future. But there is a mismatch between what we are doing and what we need to do. There's no clear implementation plan, no clear intermediate steps that we can assess our progress against year on year. One of the big barriers, I believe, when it comes to net zero, around all of us achieving a meaningful net zero agenda, is actually the over-reliance on future negative emissions and large-scale carbon sequestration. Offsetting is actually not a viable large-scale solution, and we need to tackle that part of the net zero narrative. We need a fundamental transformation of our transport, energy and food systems, as well as a shift in consumption patterns, not just patchwork of interventions. There are no silver bullets, and we need to use all the colors on the palette that we have, and the challenge is huge. Thank you.
Thank you, John. A really powerful and interesting perspective that you bring. Really interesting to see the pride that an organisation like McDonald holds in sort of leading by example. But very clear from what you've said that much of the rest of industry that isn't yet taking those steps is soon going to have their hand forced by some of the sort of wider political and market forces that are at play. And also really interesting, the systems approach that you describe and the fundamental need to embed the individual within that thinking. So thank you. I don't see any immediate questions, so we'll at this point move on to open the floor to Cameron Scott from Public. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, John. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. And just to say at the outset, I'm sorry for anyone disappointed that was expecting my brilliant colleague Sima Classy-Aldridge to be here. I'm not Sima, I'm Cameron Scott. I'm a Deputy Director at Public. At Public, we are a leading GovTech venture and technology business based here in Europe, providing support particularly to entrepreneurs and government around government technology innovation through things like acceleration and investment, research and consulting. Not dissimilar to some of the functions that Catapult provides, but on a different kind of scale, I suppose. Here at Public, I lead our government consulting team. Grateful to John for the great sort of opening there, because actually it sets the scene for some of the things that I'm going to want to talk about very quickly with you today. I'm specifically going to talk about my view of technology and innovation's role in achieving our climate ambitions, but cards on the table. I think a bit like John there, I think it's important to recognize that technology is not a panacea in this debate. We absolutely need root and branch, whole society transition, encompassing changes to policy and process and people's behavior, as he mentioned there, and of course in technology. But technology undoubtedly does have a vital role to play. It's a fundamental component of every sector, determining how we heat our homes, what food we eat and how we travel as well. And the creative disruption that we've come to know and love in the technology, or rather in the innovation sector, is critical to creating, novel ways to do old processes and scale them into production until ultimately the next thing comes along. Something we believe in heavily here at Public, and what we're actually doing, just as a quick aside, is we're working with government ahead of the COP conference in November to pilot a range of emerging digital technologies in the fight against climate change, things like in the agricultural sector, the energy systems sector, and environmental protection more broadly. I guess maybe to answer part of the research question here is, I want to talk to you about sort of technology and innovation's role, but actually I've kind of touched already upon some of the wider behavioural and policy challenges. I actually think that perhaps as an innovation challenge, developing and deploying technology is perhaps the comparatively easy part. John mentioned it there, there's no silver bullets, and there are many thorny challenges to come in terms of targets, abatement of fossil fuels, carbon taxes and carbon dividends. But actually around technology development and deployment, I'm much more hopeful. There's many lessons that we can learn over the past 10, 20, 30 years from innovation kind of action and policy more broadly that give us a more or less trodden path around technology deployment in the net zero space. To me, that's kind of two things. So scaling up existing clean technology, wind and solar generation is a good example of the kinds of technologies that I'm talking about here in the renewable space, but also electric vehicles, for instance, known technologies that we need to go further and faster on. But then also developing and deploying technologies which today aren't cost effectively scaled, but need to go on a similar journey. So a little bit behind there. So things like hydrogen power, indeed air quality monitoring and air quality improvement technologies, and things like clean fuels as well, which of course play into the air quality debate. And actually, now that the kind of scene's set around technology and innovation, I actually want to focus a bit more specifically on what the role of the public sector is. It's something that we think about a lot here at Public. Perhaps you might catch on, given the name. And in the final few minutes here, I just want to talk to you about some things that I think are important that government does in principle. I guess first thing to say is government is really vital and important, has a really vital important role to play. You know, if the lesson of the last sort of 18 months or 12 months or so around the pandemic is nothing that, you know, government action is incredibly important. And actually, I think one of the sort of the North Stars of the last 18 months has been that COVID vaccines have been developed, you know, supported in large part by government funding and government-backed innovation more generally. Government, of course, is doing many things that are great, but it could be doing more. Think of things like its 10-point plan, the net zero innovation portfolio, and actually big institutional kind of innovation like the UK Infrastructure Bank, or the reincarnation of it, and ARIA to the UK's Advanced Innovation Agency. Lots going on here that the government is already doing, but to touch on the things that I think it can do more of. Firstly, three things. Firstly, set and back an ambitious technology roadmap. I think that's incredibly important, and anyone that's worked in a sort of a leadership position or managed complex organizational change knows the power of setting that overarching coordinating strategy. A great economic transition, I think, is certainly no different, much different scale again, but no different. Without that clear strategy, the weight of public and private investment can't really be mobilized fully. We know that VC, private equity, institutional funds, you know, they require clear signals from government to satisfy their sort of risk appetite and have direction kind of clearly set for them to mobilize the kinds of capital that we need to transition away from, well, to transition to a net zero economy. You know, in that sense, and I think it's already been started to an extent with the 10-point plan, but needs to go much further and faster. We need to identify a real pathway to net zero with clear markers for the technologies that must be deployed to achieve it. It is, to an extent, a little bit about picking winners, but I think we shouldn't be afraid, given the grand societal challenge of that kind of a statement. Then, to kind of follow that up, we must absolutely continue to stand up government funds and backed investments to further crowd in and coalesce private investment, grants, co-investment, equity-backed financing, which we've seen recently with the Future Fund, even subsidies perhaps in some cases. All really important that government plays that role as sort of patient investor, providing patient capital, and that is a way to crowd in private investment. Second point is actually about setting standards from the centre for others to follow. So a kind of a softer policy intervention away from financing, but some really important ones nonetheless. I think there's a few additional levers that I think are really known to encourage innovation that we can do much more on. So firstly would be around encouraging data sharing for decarbonisation. We know and we've seen open data and shared private data being really critical to reducing the information asymmetry that we see, you know, holding back innovation and better investment in general. Energy system open data at the moment is something close to my heart and is very foundational to a green energy transition as it's going on, particularly in the UK sector actually. But others, you know, in the wider economy, in things like agriculture and land use, open data about supply chains and other things can be very helpful. A good example of this again is open banking data. Previously in the financial sector, we've seen the structural shifts that have gone on in the retail banking sector over the last few years. A second point before I move on to my final one is using public sector procurement to catalyze green behavior. Really important. You know, this is the supply side, I suppose, of the market, and government should be using all of its levers in procurement across government, central and local, to make sure that suppliers to government are signed up to emissions reduction actions. This goes much further and faster than the Social Value Act as it's currently implemented. And we're already beginning to see kind of announcements around this, but much more can be done. And then finally, I guess the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, and it's again close to the Catapult's heart, I think, and also to Public's mission, is that government should rightly act as a catalyst for new ecosystems and new partnerships. You know, government can play a really important role as a convener, and it rightly should do. where market participants might lack some of the will or knowledge to combine as the sum of more than their parts. I think that kind of manifolds in two ways. I think around the net zero portfolio that is going on at the moment. So firstly, government should be setting much clearer challenges, or maybe missions as they're called elsewhere, to crowdsource innovative technology around really defined outcomes. Those defined outcomes really help to mobilize actors in a system around common objectives and break down the barriers between them. And finally, before I finish up here, finally, the net zero innovation policy portfolio more generally, and government's policy around it, should be a real test bed for innovation, not just testing new technology features, but also being set up to test the underlying value proposition, market dynamics, and viability of certain technologies to a really sort of key thing when we're thinking about moving from the sort of innovation space to the scaling and commercialization space, is that we get ahead of those conversations as early as possible. And I think I'm just over time, so I will leave it there and hand back to you all.
Brilliant, Cameron. Thanks so much for that perspective that you bring. Really interesting. Clearly, a few points that resonate with what John has already said around needing a sort of clear roadmap around net zero, that sort of engaging and collaborating stakeholders have something to hang their hat of, I suppose. I'm also, really interested in the view you bring around a more agile approach to innovation, and ensuring that innovation is not necessarily technology-led, but focused on sort of driving value and ensuring that those sort of usability and market aspects are also front and center. Certainly one of the questions I'd be interested for us to get stuck into a little bit, perhaps through the panel session, is just understanding how, if we are to sort of back an ambitious technology roadmap, as you put it, how we can ensure that sufficiently aligns to all of the grand challenges that government is pursuing, which ultimately involves quite a complicated coordination task. So I'll just sow the seed for that. I think now we'll transition slightly towards our next group of contributors, focusing a little bit more on the practicalities of what space tech can do today. So how can satellites help businesses reach their net zero goals and improve air quality? There's been some interesting comments from Cameron and John around technology sort of being the easy bit. We're certainly seeing some really mature solutions. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Klaus from ESA to set the scene from his perspective.
Hi, thanks. I'm glad to be with you. My name is Klaus Zehner. I'm working for the European Space Agency, and I'm mission manager for the Sentinel 5B precursor, Sentinel 5 precursor mission. Sentinels are satellites that are the space segment for the Copernicus program. So, and Sentinel 5B is the first atmospheric Sentinel, the atmospheric Copernicus Sentinels. What we are setting up within this program, together with the European Commission, is a long-term commitment to provide data sets from space, sustainable over long-term to users, and Sentinel 5B is the first one on atmospheric applications. What Sentinel 5B is a polar orbiting satellite. It's flying over the poles. The Earth is turning below. Has one instrument on board, which is called Forbomi, is looking down to the Earth, and you get global coverage within 1 day. Each measurement has a spatial resolution in the range of 4 to 5 kilometers. But you can imagine you get a series of different trace gases for air quality, for example, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and aerosol information. On climate monitoring, you get information about methane. And this different information that is being provided gives you a daily data sets of 1 terabyte of data. And this is just from one satellite. There are others that are not in the field of atmosphere, providing measurements about the land surface or the ocean. In total, this system is providing on a daily basis 25 terabytes of data, just linking into what has been said before on big data. So what is Sentinel 5B providing? For example, what happened during the last 1.5 years, we are still affected by this. The reason why we have a teleconference via Zoom, COVID-19 impact on our daily life. What do you see from space on air quality? For example, I'm working in Italy, in Frascati, that's close to Rome. It's on hills above Rome. And during the COVID times, when you were looking down to Rome, instead of a brown haze over the city, where about 5 million people are living, you had clean air, like after 3 days of rain. What do you see here from space? When you look, for example, on Sentinel 5B nitrogen dioxide measurements, you see a reduction of nitrogen dioxide concentration in the range of 40 to 50%, just because due to the fact that people are not driving anymore, that industrial activities are scaled down. And you really see this from space. This is just one example. Sulfur dioxide, we saw similar results, for example, over India. There we could really identify areas where you had pollution in cities, but at the same time, we also saw areas, hotspots with high concentrations where nearly nothing has changed. Why this? Because their caloric power plants are being operated, producing electricity. And during COVID time, the production of electricity was only produced by about 10%. What we saw from space, for these areas, we saw only a reduction of emissions in the range of 15%. For areas where people were living, no production of electricity. We saw an improvement of air quality, let's say in this case, emissions of sulfur dioxide in the range of 40%. Again, measurements from space. What is also very specific for space that you get the global image. I've mentioned before, within 1 day, you cover the full Earth, and you measure always with the same instrument. So you can immediately intercompare measurements over China, over India, and also over Europe or the US. You measure always with the same instrument, and you give consistent information to the users. That's really key. This was just an example on air quality. On greenhouse gases, we are providing information about methane, a very important greenhouse gas. There are also many activities starting now, a new activity by the European Commission. A new strategy has been issued last year on methane reduction. And also here from space, you can monitor, for example, you can identify where there are big leakages even from pipelines, or where where oil and gas is being produced, where flaring is taking place. Again, we are setting up here together with the European Commission a space segment, the Sentinel satellites, with the goal to provide long-term sustainable data sets that can be used in operational manner in order to use this data to create actions or to just demonstrate differences when you have air pollution like we had during COVID times, when air pollution obviously was much lower, just to demonstrate the impact on what is happening when you change your behavior. So this is really a key information set that is being provided here. What is also important to mention here, satellite is providing one component. It's clear we have to work together with the research community. You have ground-based measurements. We have to validate our satellite measurements against ground-based measurements. There are airplane measurements, there are models, and all this has to work together in an integrated system. So satellites are providing an important component, providing the global component. For example, on air pollution, if you have a ground-based measurements, you measure just at the stationary point. You don't know where it's coming from. Satellites can help here. Here with satellite, you can see the movement. And I will stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, Klaus, for providing a sort of big picture view on the sort of space component of the solution. Of course, even within space, there are different types of systems that bring different capabilities. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Adina from GGSat to comment on what they're up to.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this event. Just by way of quick summary, GGSat is a company providing environmental services that integrate different kinds of Earth observation data and other geospatial data. So we established our European office just outside of the city in London earlier this year, and that's really because the financial services customer base is growing with demand for ESG data. So the image that Umar may put up or may not kind of shows a little bit about what we do. So basically, we are simply one part of the system that John was talking about. We have a constellation of satellites. It's the only set of satellites, public or private, that has been specifically designed for attributing greenhouse gas emissions to industrial facilities that they're coming from. So I'm not sure that my science team would say this is the easy part, but it certainly is a very successful part, and it's one nut that we have cracked already. So that's great. We've validated the technology with the ground control measurements that Klaus was talking about. So we've done blind controlled emissions releases with the oil and gas community. So we know how much is coming out. Well, we don't at the time, we find out afterwards, and we measure it with the satellites, and we provide that to our customers. So we as a business have supported the mitigation of methane emissions, particularly from oil and gas infrastructure around the world. And just to give a sense of it, one of the larger emissions that we intervened with the operator to have addressed was emitting the equivalent, a methane equivalent in CO2 of 1 million passenger vehicles on the road for a year. So some of these are really big emission sources. So there's a huge opportunity for impact. Some industries are switched on to what we're doing, oil and gas for sure, while others are behind the times a bit, and I won't name and shame in that sense. I'd like to echo Cameron's comments about the role of the public sector. Public sector procurement is really important for supporting the emissions reduction policymakers. So we all want to see good policy, but they need the evidence base to do that. And let's get them the evidence that they need as quickly as we can. And then I also wanted to echo John's comments about using everything in our arsenal. So thank you, Klaus, for Sentinel 5P. Thank you, Isa. We use it all the time. It's fantastic. And we, like I say, we pull in all kinds of geospatial data, anything that helps us answer the question that our customers are trying to understand, which is where are the emissions coming from and how big are they? So the main barrier, if I were to try and pin it down to a barrier right now for us in achieving the full impact, it really comes down to solving the institutional barriers and making sure that we're not always on the quest for exquisite science. Sometimes when we know the answer, we needn't pinpoint it, you know, the specifics of the measurement, and let's just get out there and fix the problem if we can. The exquisite science is absolutely necessary, but sometimes it takes a while. So let's get to the immediate action and impact that's in front of us. So that's really where I'm coming from. Thanks a lot, Dan, and happy to discuss now or later with any of the participants.
Thank you, Adina. Great to put some of what we've heard already into context and start to hear about sort of tangible actions coming off the back of some of this technology, clearly illustrating that this tech is being used today and that is creating real impact, and also interesting the point that you pick up on this kind of tension of, well, what is good enough today to translate to an impact versus really working on that exquisite science, and clearly a role for both of those in parallel. At this point, I would ask Emma Haskett to come to the stage, as it were, to bring in a slightly different perspective of a user of some of these technologies in providing solutions in the energy sector. Emma.
Thanks, Dan. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Haskett, and I work for a renewable energy company based in Cornwall called Benjamin Energy. Our business model is based around removal of methane emissions from atmosphere and actually using that methane as a better than net zero form of energy. In case you don't know, methane is emitted from all organic matter as it decays, and if we don't capture it, it's 86 times more damaging to the atmosphere than CO2 in terms of its global warming potential. So just by capturing fugitive methane, it actually results in climate repair. Our business model, it operates right across the value chain. So we've created a proprietary set of technologies that capture, process, store, distribute, and consume fugitive methane. And our customer base is split into two distinct groups. We've got the supply side, so those that capture methane, and the demand side, those that consume it. And the business model is about creating energy networks that connects those two different sets of customers. Our early adopter supply side customers are farms. So farms, sewage plants, food waste plants, they're all big emitters of fugitive methane. Agriculture is also one of the main sources of air pollutants in the EU. So by using anaerobic digestion, which involves covering over slurry lagoons, you improve the odor and you reduce ammonia, CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane. Another early adopter segment that we're looking at is grasslands owners. So any business that has access to large areas of grassland. Grass is an excellent feedstock for the anaerobic digestion process. And when you think about it, a cow's stomach is essentially a grass-fed AD. So our business model offers any of those businesses that have those waste clippings the opportunity to turn that waste into a form of renewable energy. On the demand side, our customers can be any businesses who want to replace fuel, gas, or electricity with our form of renewable energy. It's an incredibly flexible form of energy. So if you liquefy it, you can replace it for petrol or diesel. Equally, it's a better than net zero form of green gas, which can replace natural gas from the grid. And if you run it through a generator, it creates, again, better than net zero form of electricity. We get really excited by customers who are both supply and demand side customers. An example of that is that we're currently deploying our technology on 6 council farms in Cornwall, 6 dairy farms. So they start to generate renewable fuel. And on the other side, on the demand side, the council has a fleet of 1,100 vehicles that they use to manage highways and maintain their estates. So they're looking to transition those vehicles to ultra-low vehicles over the next 5 to 10 years. So by being both a supply and demand side customer, the council gets the opportunity to simultaneously decarbonize both agriculture and transport. So what does any of this have to do with satellites? Actually, satellite data is at the beating heart of our business model. The entire portfolio is IoT enabled and SATCOM's IoT enabled. Because we deploy a lot in rural locations, we need the ability to have reliable connectivity that can allow us to monitor and control the entire portfolio. And that does 2 things. It means that the customer is very hands-off in terms of being able to engage with the technology, and we certainly don't want them to have to engage with it. And the second thing that it does is that it allows us to have a dynamic understanding of supply and demand across the energy network. We also use Earth observation in our business model. So back to our grasslands customers, we use it in 2 ways. We use it as a prospecting tool. So a customer comes through, they've got an area of land, of grasslands. We use EO data to map the likely revenue and methane that they can generate from that parcel of land as a sort of a BD tool. Once that customer is onboarded, we use EO data to create a dynamic management plan for those grasslands. So mow field A today because the dry matter content is just where it needs to be. Mow field B tomorrow. So in our business models, satellites are an absolutely key component to unlocking the sort of energy revolution that we're aiming to create. That's me.
Wonderful, thanks, Emma. A really interesting and sort of practical summary on the application of some of these technologies and also the importance of that kind of cross-sector innovation approach to really standing up some of these solutions. So finally, and last but by no means least, I will open the floor to Umar from Enzin, who has very much been at the forefront of this challenge space for some time now. So really interesting to hear her perspective.
Thank you, Don. Hello. Thank you, Dan. And thanks for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my experience and what we do at Enzen. I'm Umar, Head of Applied Research and Collaboration Function at Enzen Global Solution. It's an energy and environment company with the headquarters in India and having a presence in globally. And we have an office in UK. So we mainly work on energy and environmental issues. I would like to share our experience on using the space technology and big data for addressing the both climate change issues and local air quality problem. As you all aware, the air quality is of serious concern in developing countries, and especially India is on the dubious distinction. And there are a number of small and other sources which contributes, which are posing a significant challenges, even both on the inventory side and also improving the air quality. So I would like to share like a few examples how we use the space technology for informing the key stakeholders and addressing the challenges. So one is on the brick making, which is one of the small scale industry and which contributes to significant air quality problem, both on the local as well as on the greenhouse gases. And we are working on identifying these small industries based on the space technology. And this will also help in improving the emission inventory. So now the regulators are introducing technology-based standards to improve the air quality and also reduce the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and both the health damaging pollutants from these industries. But the ground level challenge is the identifying these kiln location and also its contribution. That's where like the space technology plays a very, very important role. And currently we are working with the Catapult satellite applications on identifying these small scale industry, that is the brick making industry, its location, and also based on that the number of kilns and their contribution towards this air pollution. This provides a valuable information to improve the emission inventory and also to address these challenges. And stakeholders, both from the regulators as well as the public can use and research community can use this information. Another one is on the sensor-based air quality monitoring. So now we one of the important challenges on how to influence the users for the behavioral change. So that's where it plays a very important role. So now we are strengthening the air quality monitoring and informing the public about the air quality data and identifying the hotspots. So this will provide a valuable information for behavioral change. So these are the things like I would like to share my experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Umar. A really interesting perspective that talks to the wider scale of the problem. I think we can sometimes have a tendency to be quite UK centric in our view, but clearly it's a problem that as a global community we need to tackle, and that of course will very much be the emphasis of the discussion at COP later this year. So a really fantastic kind of insight from those four speakers into the sort of tangible applications of the technology and the capabilities that it has today. We've received quite a few good questions through on the Q&A, so I think at this point we'll transition to those. So I would invite all of the speakers from today to share their faces, and we can get going. So I think the first question that I'd like to pick up on is from Jazz, and that question is, how do you think the technology industry can change consumer behavior to push towards net zero? So I'd like to hand that one over to Adina to kick us off.
Thanks, Dan. That's a great question, Jazz. I'm gonna twist it a little bit, and rather than the consumer, I'll talk about the business, because we really do business to business in GGSat, and it's really interesting on how we've managed to push changes in behavior. And actually, it's really simple. We find the emissions, and then we call them, or we email them, or we knock on their door, and we tell them what we see. And that's often a bit of an awkward conversation at the beginning, but once they realize that we're not there to name and shame them, but rather we're there to work with them to resolve their emissions problems, then they get on side, and they take the time to start to understand the technology. So really just knocking on people's doors, having a conversation, and educating them in a non-confrontational way is what we've done. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Adina. Perhaps I'll offer that up to anybody else that would like to pose a sort of perspective on that question.
Just a brief comment from my side. I think it's really not, it's easy to say we should change the behavior of the consumers, but you have to do it step by step. And what we have seen now during COVID, when we had these severe restrictions, that with simple images coming from satellite data, we really could show the impact when you are not contributing to the air pollution, when you stay at home, when industry is down. Does this mean that people should all stay at home now and should work from home? Is this the future? Is this a behavior? No, I don't think so. But it's just the first step is to make people aware and simple. I'm also coming from more a scientific background. We are always going into the details, but what we have seen as a space agency, just providing simple imaging. You cannot imagine what kind of feedback we got from newspapers, just providing this pre-COVID situation and then situation when you see the air pollution during restrictions in COVID. So make people aware as a first step.
I'll just jump in with one extra thought, Dan, as well. And I think Klaus and Adina, those points about awareness are super interesting. We've all lived through the climate denial era, so awareness is certainly the next best step after that. Maybe just the technology industry specifically, to add on to that, I think, and it's something that we've been looking at Public through some of our research activities, is gamification, and really sort of that's basically the step beyond, I think, in consumer behavior, which is not just awareness but real engagement. And you can do that through things like communications, but actually I think gamification of the solutions that they're interacting with. Maybe it's just me because I'm very competitive, but seeing where I am in relation to perhaps other people might be very effective, and there's certainly some research out there which proves it from behavioral economics. So there's much more here to say, but I think in general that principle is one worth thinking about.
But also worth remembering that the technology change doesn't always automatically lead to that improved consumer consumption behavior. Two opposing examples. We have had a really great improvement in car emissions on the scale of the individual car, but that has actually led to worse overall air pollution because of increased consumption of transport by cars. On the other hand, you have something like mobile telephony in East Africa, where that shift to mobile phones and mobile banking has led to an opportunity to roll out solar panels across communities, making it really efficient and embedded in the communities, and making that change. So it's actually about really following what is the what are the trade-offs when certain things happen.
Yeah, I would like to add to what my peers they spoke about, and one example is like how these evidences, that is like how we can show the evidence to influence the consumer behavior. One example is shifting from the private mode of like the vehicle to the public transport help in reducing the greenhouse gas emission, as well as on the improving the local air quality. So showing the map and also like the exposure based approach, like how much they are exposed to the air quality, and creating an awareness help in promoting the public transport, and also the reduce the transport related pollution.
Wonderful. So an interesting range of perspectives there, and front and center is clearly this challenge around communication and how we reach the right audience, and then the incentive around making a different choice, I suppose. So perhaps just taking the conversation in a slightly different direction, we've as a scientist, I see lots of great examples of technology being used for modeling, for monitoring, etc. But a sort of a lack of really strong ability to translate that into sort of action and adoption. I mean, what do the panel feel that the key blockers to that translation are?
That's a great question, Dan. The blockers of, so for our case, I could talk about blockers in different sectors, but I'll point to oil and gas just because that's the one where we're most mature, and you don't want me to talk for 5 hours. But really, the blockers have changed over time, right? It's all about the money. So executive bonus pay is now attached to performance on greenhouse gas emissions in the oil and gas sector. And across the business, people are aware of it. So where you used to go in and speak to a middle manager about capabilities for environmental applications, it might get lost in the noise. But now it's recognized across the business, all the way top to bottom, that change needs to come on the emissions front, and they're all ready to do it. So where you might have buy-in at the mid-level before, now when they go talk to the lower levels in the operations side, they buy in too. So it's across the business, and that's changed a lot. And then the blockers often comes down to individuals. To be honest, it's who wants to work with it, and who wants to solve the problem.
Thanks, Adina. I wonder, Emma, if you're seeing sort of something similar in the sectors that you're working in.
Yeah, I think for me, Dan, there's a lot happening, and actually speaking to the earlier point that we were talking about sort of policy and the role of government. I think in terms of actually being an early adopter and getting out there and taking the insights and turning them into action, at least for our business, they have been a real change agent. So you've got big business that, as Adrina was saying, are being driven by finance and investment, but at the policy level, and especially the local government level, you've got a real set of early adopters who have the information, have been getting the information for many, many years now, but are now getting budgets unlocked to be able to act on that information. And that for us is very exciting as a business.
Thank you, Emma. Are there any comments from others on that topic?
Just one quick comment from my side. What has been mentioned before is really key. Try to convince politicians that they have to act, because they are making the laws and people have to follow them. Then just to expect that individuals are reacting. Some of them will, but most of them will not. I think you have to really target politicians, or also people working at also the European Commission, people who are in the power to set rules that have to be followed.
Thanks, Klaus. I wonder, whilst you have the mic, there is a question here for you from Alex Wood that's asking, is ESA monitoring who's using their data and what they're using it for? Do you have a sense of what the impact of this data is that you're using?
Yeah, we are registering the users, and we see who is using it, and also where the users are located. So for Sentinel 5P, we see that most of the data are being used in Europe, in the US, and in China. And also on the applications, we also have some ideas on what the data are being used.
Thank you, Klaus.
Dan, I just wanted to jump in on the previous point really quickly, because I think just maybe actually to channel John for a second, who I thought said something really interesting about systems thinking earlier in the call, and actually to respond to Adina and Emma, who are both out there sort of on the front lines with talking with solution providers, being able to maybe at the highest level, climate change is a collective action problem, right, in some senses. So actually being able to, if we're talking about economic change and transition, then there is a range of actors here that we need to engage along the way. It's not just the local authority, and it's not just the oil and gas company. It's all of those people in tandem, and being able to, particularly if you're an entrepreneur, being able to, or working in that kind of innovation space, build networks and kind of a consortium amongst those groups is the best way to kind of mobilize, I think, change quite quickly. Not necessarily always the easiest thing to do, but I think, around this change, because there are so many dependent nodes in the system, you need to touch on all of them.
Thanks, Cameron. A really important view. I think something that I'd like to pick up on there is, again, to sort of John's point about a systems approach. My experience says that often there are different technology sectors coming at this problem from different angles, and often working in a sort of siloed way, which is another layer of complexity to add on to those sort of nodes in the decision-making chain that you describe. Is there something that we need to be doing sort of differently or better to address that? Perhaps first aimed at John and Cameron to answer.
I think there is, because the first step is to create the awareness of how interlinked different things are, and how important it is to understand that a set of actions in one area can either have synergies with other areas or adverse effects to it, and that insight and that knowledge needs to be out there, and there are great tools to help with that around systems mapping and help visualizing those connections and make people realize that. And I think another aspect of that, which is important, is generally to accept that we constantly need to re-educate and update our knowledge ourselves. What we believed were the facts 5, 10, 12, 15 years ago are no longer necessarily the facts, particularly when it comes to economics. And that changes how you can undertake certain things, because the economics have changed. And that would probably be the biggest message to decision makers in businesses and in government. Don't rely on something you learned 5, 10, 15 years ago, because things change. And that's a clear communications challenge for the people who have that evidence and who pursue that new evidence.
I'll just follow up. I'll follow up, but I'm sure others have got interesting things to say as well. But I guess I was gonna say that the important, I guess, revert back to the roadmap kind of idea, I suppose, perhaps the mission idea in government as perhaps a unifying thing. So I think something that does really help connect organizations across different organizational boundaries is the sense that there is some, overarching mission that they're all kind of working towards, that I think can help, to your point, Emma, that kind of helps to coalesce different funding pots in areas like local government, if there's kind of defined missions that everyone and goals people are working towards. and just having that kind of overarching strategy, I think, is a helpful way to break down that kind of systems level change. But others, I'm sure, will have other things.
Thanks, Cameron. Please welcome others to comment on this topic.
I think it's a great question, Dan. And actually, to the earlier points, you know, the impact of a technology on one point of the sort of circular economy, you know, utilizing a lot of EVs, for example, you know, we're all going to be deploying EVs at scale. The impact that has in terms of natural capital, end of use, you know, so there's different technology players across that sort of circular economy. And I think, especially where we are sort of trying to build those circular economies, understanding the impacts of, yeah, we've got zero emissions here, but actually look at all of the natural capital we've had to sort of pull from the ground in order to get to that point, and what happens at the end of life. You know, it's really key. And, you know, that systems thinking and that sort of interrelationship between those different points will be absolutely critical to deliver a real long-term solution.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Clearly a role for both, you know, the need to reduce as well as sort of mitigate through some of those approaches. Unless there's any other immediate comment from anybody, I'd like to jump to a great question that's come in through the chat from Catherine McKinley, who's asking, from a global perspective, do you have any thoughts on which countries or regions are doing well in different aspects of climate change? That is policy, technology development, cultural adoption, etc. I think it's a great question because we've been quite focused on a sort of organizational level in terms of progress. But does anybody have a comment on that?
If I can, just one example, using satellites data where you really get the global picture. It's more on air quality than on climate. But what we see looking at the time series of data sets, that in Europe, but also in China, air pollution is really going down. And at the same time, for example, sulfur dioxide, after 2016, you really see reduced emissions over China. For nitrogen dioxide after 2008. But then you look over India and there you see an increase. And this you really see from satellite. It's really also, it's depending on the population, and people in India, they like to have the same standard as we have now. And then it takes time to adapt to new legislation to reduce emissions. What we have seen, for example, in China, you really see when they put filters into their stacks when they were burning coal. You really see this from space.
I think, John, you were going to jump in with something.
Exactly. I think there are actually a lot of individual examples from different countries. It's not just about a single country having a better sort of profile than others. But I find it fascinating that a country like Bangladesh has managed to adapt to very significant climate change impacts by making sure it has been taken seriously, by engaging their communities, by making use of satellite data and everything. And today, it's strange to see that there are massive deaths in Germany as a consequence of severe flooding. And you have a country like Bangladesh that has managed to find ways. Just one example, and I think we should actually do more to explore those individual areas. People surviving earthquakes in Iran because of much better measures in disaster resilience to earthquakes. And picking those examples across the globe will be really important, and lots we can learn from all across Europe and all across the world, sorry.
I would like to add on the addressing the air quality issue from the developing country perspective. And it is like a very well said now, I mean, China, Bangladesh, India, and the growing air quality is of serious concern. And if you look into the last 5 years, there are several measures have been taken up by the government of India, but still that issue, because both on the population growth and also the economic activity, the air quality is also like the deteriorating. And this becomes like the serious concern. And the recent one after the 2019 the air quality issue, the government has taken some initiative. One is identifying this the crop burning using the satellite technology, and also like the how to ban such things. And both are like the both state government and also like the central government and all the collaboration. So these are like the some of the things that in the recent years, like there are like some initiatives, but still it's a long way to take and also adopt some best practices and interventions in other sectors. For an example, the household air pollution, small scale industries, and the transport. So these are like some of the sectors we need to address.
Thank you, Umar. Was there any other comment on that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that last point. It's such a great point on addressing these things, and one more to add is actually supply chain. So if we think about what countries are performing well, you know, we're looking around the world all the time trying to find emissions, and there's a couple sites in particular in Europe that Klaus is familiar with that we try to capture pictures, and they just don't emit at the same rates as some other sites around the world. So that's good news, but also it means that within Europe we need to take it to the next step, which is looking at the supply chain and where are those next elements within the supply chain. If we're okay, what's down the line?
A really interesting sort of last point there, Adina, and perhaps a good setup for a final question, which to the panel, which is, you know, what do we think the future looks like for air quality solutions and their adoption?
Sorry, Dan, could you just repeat the question? Someone's walking across my balcony.
That's okay. I guess just the perspective from the panel on what we think the future looks like for these types of solutions and the way that we will as a society adopt and use them.
I think I'll jump in with that one, Dan. For us, it's a really straight answer, right? You've got emissions that are going to atmosphere, they're damaging the planet. Let's just capture them and utilize them as energy. You know, and there's a whole host of other environmental benefits that come along with that. So it's quite simple for us. You know, just get the job done and deploy at scale.
The future from my perspective looks like a lot of satellites, a lot of organizations, companies, everything. Satellites are launching that can do this, and we need to make sure that we do the thing that we've all been talking about, which is translated into action and impact. So I won't tell the science team that it's easy, but you know, they're cracking it. So let's use it.
Yeah, I would like to add that we are getting the systems in place to provide data for the monitoring that can be used in models that then provide capabilities to look into the future. But I'm also maybe working at the European Space Technology. I'm more on the technical side, but I believe that we as human beings, we can adapt, and we are using technology to do so. It's not going as fast as we would like, but I'm quite positive. First, we have to highlight what are the problems, and then I'm sure we all together we find technical solutions. So I'm quite positive.
I'm very optimistic in future that technology will play a very important role in influencing the stakeholder as well as for bringing the behavioral change among the communities.
I'll just add in that I think it's great that we, you know, here under the banner of the satellite applications Catapult that we're talking about the use of geospatial data. I think alongside the hard technology components that we're talking about today, I think some of the use cases for geospatial data in terms of identifying, I'm in the middle of London right now, and I would love some nature-based solutions to air quality around me. And I think there's a nice component here where we can sort of align some of the hard technology with some of the kind of touchable things that we're all going to see and feel in the future in the places that we live.
And I don't know, John, if you had a final thought.
Well, I think it's coming back to, as Cameron just said, that personal experience. What does it mean to people? And that's the nut we have to crack. That is to make sure that all these great technological solutions, that they can be described, explained, and understood by people for the value that they have in changing their lives.
Wonderful. Well, a really great sort of collection of thoughts for us to end with. I'm conscious we've come up to the end of time, and it feels as though we're only scraping the surface on this conversation. From my perspective, lots of really interesting topics covered. Some of the key takeaways for me are that there's clearly a challenge around communication. Telling the right story to suit the right stakeholder. Something around sort of systems approaches needing to be front and center of the way we deal with this, and the fact that relies heavily on kind of cross-sector, cross-organization, cross-country collaboration. Recognizing that the science that we have today is doing the job, creating impacts, and we need to be continuing to evolve that science in parallel with getting on and creating those impacts. And then finally, the fact that success really is about a whole society transition. So how do we get the individual incentivized and bought into this journey? Some really interesting last comments from Cameron and John there about let's think about what people kind of want in their lives, and let's tailor solutions to solve these problems around them. That's definitely a pathway to adoption. And then finally, gamification has come up quite a lot. There are some interesting comments in the chat around that as potentially a route to getting that engagement that we need. So I just want to extend a really...
Dan, can I just say, I love the real-time illustrations. That's absolutely fabulous.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, John. We thought we'd steer away from too many slides and try and do something a little bit more dynamic. We will, of course, be sharing this with everybody to reflect on afterwards. I'm also conscious that there have been a huge number of comments and questions that we haven't touched on today. So we'll be sure at the Catapult to pick up on those and make sure we respond, and particularly where there were questions to particular participants, we'll get them to respond. So thank you for that. And finally, just to extend a really huge thank you to everybody that's participated today. We've really got a great collection of experts and experience here, and it's been a really thought-provoking and interesting discussion, and a great way for us to kick off our year of climate activity. So thank you all once again.
Pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.